Despite the setbacks of 1970, in November the band had returned to the studio to begin work on their follow-up to Morrison Hotel. Yet early into these sessions, the Doors' normal recording process broke down. Unhappy with the new material, producer Paul Rothchild had quit, leaving engineer Bruce Botnick to take the reins. In December, they had relocated to the Doors' workshop, their two-story business office in Santa Monica, recording with basic equipment in a non-studio setting. By January 1971, Botnick had enlisted two notable outsiders to complement the band's new sound, session bassist Jerry Sheff and Mark Benno, a young blues guitarist from Texas who had made his name working with Leon Russell.
Man, that was an intense record. God, it was an intense record. We had a small room that had cables everywhere and loads of equipment, just mics everywhere, just crowded and crap, and then a drive-in movie talkback speaker. It was just a little down and out room. I was just thinking, this will never work. This is going to sound like shit. I mean, we're down here doing this garage stuff. I don't know why they would pass on having the best studios, Wally Hyder, right across the street. I don't know what we're doing. After hearing a few cuts, I thought, well, this is amazing. Bruce has got this stuff sounding, yeah, it sounds a lot better than I thought it was going to, so I'm just going to play down there, you know. And it was cool because Jim was knocking over mics, tripping over stuff. There was stuff everywhere, and he didn't want to just stand still, you know, and be appropriate. He went guerrilla rock on the whole deal. He was an inspiration. I mean, once he'd get into it, it was like I realized that he didn't need an audience, that he was going to do Jim Morrison to get into his vocals, his intensity for his messages. He was into it all the way, so, you know, it made me want to get into whatever I could contribute.
And having joined the group with no real musical training or distinct influences, Morrison now viewed the blues not only as an appealing genre, but as a world in which he could put to rest his previous persona and re-emerge as a new kind of performer. And for him, the new material wasn't pushing this as far as he'd have liked.
I think he wanted it to be even more of just an authentic, straight bar blues album, some of it. I think that Jim, yeah, that not only was so interested in the blues as a new type of music that he began to listen to in a new way, but a lifestyle. How could he go ahead? You know, he's always saying, it's so hard, they don't want me to change. And I think he was talking about that his theater and his psychedelia was getting difficult for him. I knew that he had some really deep feelings about life. He was a very smart guy, and he seemed to appear to be in some great pain of life. Basically the blues of, you know, no one does disappointment like a blues man. So there were things that to him, I think that it would have fit him, where he could have lived without having to be such a visual performer. He could have just stood there and he looked cool and done the blues. And I think he was looking for something that would sustain his life more, because he knew he was so on the edge and there was a lot of frustration with it. I mean, I felt for this guy. I thought all his acting out was, there was a lot of frustration behind it.
Whatever Morrison's frustrations, on its release in March 1971, the album LA Woman was warmly received by those critics who had accepted the band's new blues-influenced approach. Although not as successful commercially as its predecessors, it proved that the Doors had found a viable musical route away from the pop excesses of the soft parade.
It became a commercial pop album. I call it pop because it's just, it has some happy progressions in it. It has some uplifting stuff in it. It's not a low-down blues album and was not mixed as one, and that was probably the success of it, too.
I think in LA Woman, I mean, Morrison had recuperated enough, had enough distance from Miami, although that was still dogging him. But, you know, he was able to get in touch with his artistic self again. It was, you know, in some senses the music was simpler and not as avant-garde as the first couple albums. But there was also this eerie edge to it that made it, I think, what Doors fans always wanted.
LA woman, LA woman, LA woman, Sunday afternoon. LA woman, Sunday afternoon.
LA Woman is probably my favourite Doors album. On paper, it should have been a complete failure. I mean, it's at the end of their career. It should be a very jaded album. What amazes me about it is how energetic it is. You'd have thought it was going to be a very jaded reflection on LA, and that musically it would sound jaded because they were at the end of their career and all the rest of it. But no, not at all. It reminds me more of what somebody would do for a debut album. It's incredibly energetic. I mean, Morrison's vocal execution is at times frantic. The much discussed title track is, in many people's view, the key to the album. It's a wonderful evocation of that LA noir, but you can see a great sense of excitement in Morrison's approach to it. Although it's LA noir, which suggests jaded, also Hotel California, we've been through it all, or at the end of, it could be the end or something like that, but it's not. I think there's a great sense of joie de vivre in that album. I mean, when he talks about topless bars and cops in cars, he's relishing that imagery and is becoming part of it. The whole idea of the LA woman, he's pursuing her and he's the hunter of her. He's not somebody that's abandoning her and saying, I've been through all this with a jaundiced sense of debauchery. It's almost like he's arrived in LA that afternoon. It's tremendously energetic, and that's reflected in the music as well. But Morrison's vocal sounds positively passionate.
There's a reiteration of a lot of things, a lot more mature about things. Cars Hiss By My Window is a very different love song than Light My Fire. There's a realization here of some of the ramifications of just going out there and pursuing, uninhibitedly, touch me, light my fire, etc. Or hello, I love you. You're walking down the beach, well, hello, I love you. Well, all right, you got a cold lover next to you in this room, cars hiss by my window, who's going to get out of here alive? Maybe I won't. No, that would never have fitted on that song could never have been put on the first album. And I'm not sure the boys would have even thought of having that kind of vision, that kind of music or that kind of lyric on the first few albums. So if you look at the album as a whole and all the individual songs pieced together, there's a maturity level there.
It was an album that should have ended the Doors on an anticlimactic note in a sense, but it doesn't. It's as thrilling as the debut in many respects, and I think that there's a wonderful symmetry between the excitement that you experienced upon first hearing that Doors album and how original it was, and this final album, which is unlike any final album I've ever heard from any other band in a sense. It really is for a group that have done half a dozen albums in such a short period to go out on such a high. You'd have expected them to go out with another Soft Parade where it's just diffusion, and you got Robbie, you do a song, Jim, you do a song. Oh, I can't be bothered. It's the end of the thing anyway. But it's not. I mean, it sounds like they could have gone on and done another 6 albums. So to me, it's a wonderful epitaph to the Doors' career. And sadly, if we could have got one more tour out of it, we'd have had a live document of it as well, which would have been great to have experienced. But maybe that's part of the myth of the story as well, that there wasn't.
And as with many of the Doors records, the final track was an epic in which Morrison's poetic ambitions were free to flourish. The frontman and lyricist could not have wished for a more fitting swan song than Riders on the Storm.
I think it's unintentional, but I think LA Woman, the album, it is kind of a fitting final statement from the Doors. It's kind of sad to reflect upon it now because it wasn't known at the time they were recording that Jim Morrison was going to die, and although the other Doors were a little worried that maybe he'd be leaving the band or at least take an extended absence or maybe even go to jail, they weren't thinking that it was the end of the line. It has that unintentional Tombstone quality, though, when the last track is Riders on the Storm, because it really sounds with a double-track vocal, which was a great production idea. One line is sung or crooned and one is whispered. It almost sounds as though Jim Morrison really has one foot in the next life, because one is him singing in his relatively normal voice, and the other it sounds like he's whispering beyond the grave.
Riders on the storm. Riders on the storm. Riders on the storm.
It's very evocative of the way that he did happen to die, and the way he lived his life, and the way that his observations continue to echo. Now it's more than 35 years later.
Riders on the storm. Riders on the storm. Riders on the storm.
Try to imagine any other song following up after that. I mean, sure, if Jim would have survived, there would have been more music. But try to imagine there being, oh, we got this in the can too. This was something we did after Riders on the Storm. I mean, there's probably not a more appropriate ending for the Doors as a group than Riders on the Storm.
Shortly after the album's release, Morrison left Los Angeles for Paris, and 3 months later, the singer was found dead in his apartment. Contradictory accounts and curious details regarding the actual pattern of events shrouded the charismatic frontman's death in mystery, and to this day debates continue as to how, and even if, Morrison died. Yet the singer's passing affected not only the band and those who knew him, but popular music and culture itself. Along with the deaths of Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, Morrison represented one of the most significant casualties of the 1960s counterculture.
The death of Jim Morrison and the death of Janis Joplin, these were two rock stars whom I was closest to, or felt close to, especially Janis Joplin, but also Jim Morrison, was a tremendous blow to me. I felt as if nobody stopped them. There was no such thing as an intervention in the 1960s, and especially with Janis Joplin. And I reached the point where I couldn't write about rock music anymore, and those deaths really were the reason why. I almost had a sort of a phasic problem. I couldn't really put pen to paper. There was just too much horror. And I was too acutely aware of the sacrificial ritual that rock performance was becoming. That is, the performer just got up and destroyed himself or herself, and the audience loved it. You were destroying yourself for the delectation of the audience. And you know, this isn't really shamanism anymore. This is a more neurotic show business ritual that goes back to Judy Garland and other performers, in which the audience is sadistic, finally. And I think this, I found this repugnant, and it really ended my career as a rock critic.
Despite the band pursuing their career past Morrison's death, with the album's Other Voices and Full Circle, without their inimitable frontman, they lacked their previous appeal. And as time passed, it was the legend of Morrison, rather than the music of the Doors, that was most remembered.
It's strange, for a while, the 1970s, which is when I became really aware of the whole Doors output. I pretty much just knew the singles as a small kid. The Doors were underestimated. I think they were kind of thought of as like this phenomenon which had happened, but especially because Jim Morrison wasn't around, they were almost semi-forgotten. At the very end of the 1970s, when the book by Jerry Hopkins and Danny Sugarman came out, No One Here Gets Out Alive, it unexpectedly became a bestseller. I got that when I was 17. It reignited interest in the Doors, and a cruel reason for this, we don't like to acknowledge it, but this is the way things work in our culture. He was dead, so that added some romance to his legend. He died in very mysterious circumstances. A lot of people say we're not sure that he even died. He might have faked his own death in Paris. But also because he died at the point he did when he was 27, it's the same thing with Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, who died roughly around the same time. It's almost as though they were preserved in that moment of time, embalmed, almost at the peak of not just their musical powers, but their physical powers. He was permanently this like youthful god that, rightly or wrongly, cemented his image as epitomizing a certain sort of on-the-edge rock lifestyle. You know, the ultimate stud going out and exploring the limits of acceptable behavior, both within his music and outside of the music.
I mean, not insignificant. As soon as he dies and they try to go on, it just doesn't work. I mean, the Doors without Jim Morrison, he's just too powerful an iconic figure to be detached from the Doors. But that creates problems in itself because, you know, the Doors weren't just Jim Morrison's backing band. I mean, musically, they were so crucial to the whole thing. You take the Doors away from Jim Morrison and what are we left with? Well, actually, an empty icon, in my view, someone with all the posturing but without the music to back it up. I think the crucial thing never to forget, of course, is that Morrison wasn't a musician. He couldn't have gone out there and done this stuff without those guys, and without those guys being empathetic to what he was doing. And Morrison without the Doors is almost akin to, you know, hearing someone, I would imagine it's akin to hearing someone like, you know, Charles Manson, where you've got the madness and a sense of wild creativity, but it's not harnessed in any one direction. And the result is this kind of mental chaos that is finding a way to come out. Morrison's death, of course, colours everything. That has coloured the whole legacy of the Doors. It's somehow taken away, I think, from the music. It's made the music, in many respects, subsidiary to the Jim Morrison image. And in a way, it cannot be denied that if you're talking in terms of legacy, alas, that is his legacy. The legacy of the Doors is subservient to and it shouldn't be, but it is, it's subservient to the myth of Morrison.
I think that kids who are into it today, and as I said, I get more mail from teenagers than I do from people in my own age group about that. Even teenagers who've read my book, which I'm really not happy about. They don't have the context. They identify with the flash and the image, you know, and especially with the movie, which I seem to spend half my life these days debunking on any number of podiums. I think he'd be really unhappy with the way he's being perceived, much like Jesus would be if Jesus came back and saw what's going on in his name. I think, you know, Jim would be whipping the money changers out of the temple. He'd be, you know, furious with these people for appropriating something that they don't understand in the slightest. As long as they relate to the music, I think that's fine, because I think the music holds up spectacularly. Much as I love the Airplane, it's a very dated sound, even though it's brilliant, even though they're all incredible musicians. The Doors really sound like they could have recorded that stuff yesterday.
You have to look at the material, Morrison's material, ultimately as a statement of anxiety. It's anxiety about aesthetics. It's anxiety about sexuality. It's anxiety about the body. All of these things and more anxieties are all manifest in the music. And I think, you know, if you're willing to admit that you're anxious, then you understand the music.
Consistent. They had a very powerful vision, artistic vision, and they stayed with it. And it resonates. I mean, as long as there's going to be young people who are restless, who want to taste life as a journey, who see that life is both light and dark, as long as there's a young group of people feeling that, this music's always going to resonate.
Thank you.